1 year after I left the National Assembly, I decided that the best thing to do, which is what most people do in the civilized world after they exit, take a hater from public service, is personal development. And so one of the things that was of great interest to me in the National Assembly, quite aside from foreign policy, which I had the opportunity to chair for 8 years, the Foreign Relations Committee, was the Defense Committee, which I also was a member of. And so one of the things that piqued my interest was, and I'd always made the point while I was in the National Assembly, that for us to have a defense policy or a foreign policy that worked, that we must have a foreign policy that interfaced with our defense policy, with our migration policy, and that our foreign policy, everybody says that, was a reflection of our domestic policy. But in foreign policy, you learn that might is right. And so I felt that our foreign policy would only be as strong as our defense policy was. And that in a world where we're dealing with trans-border crimes, most of the crimes are trans-border, that it was imperative that they be a stronger overlay between our defense policy and our foreign policy. Now, I felt that from experience, I had a bit of knowledge, frontline knowledge from foreign policy, and I thought it was important for me to have more than a working knowledge of our defense policy. Now, what it is in Nigeria's defense space now is terrorism, counter-terrorism, and that Nigeria has fought a war, the terrorism war, for 10 years. And and even though there are different narratives that come out of that space with a downgraded Boko Haram, we also find that with ISIS losing a lot of real estate in the Middle East, that they found space within the Lake Chad Basin. And so, of course, there was a growth of ISIS West Africa, there was Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, we had Boko Haram pledging allegiance to all those places, to ISIS, as well as Al-Qaeda. And so we found an upsurge in the activities, a more audacious, would I say, approach by the terrorists. Even though they were in splinter groups, we found more audacious attacks on civilian targets in Nigeria. And so I wanted to understand exactly what was going on, what could be done, as well as the fact that I know that while I was as chair of foreign affairs, that every time we had a conversation with our partners, our strategic partners, that the conversation was always about them coming to help us in this counterterrorism war. Now, there wasn't a lot of help coming in tangible terms. Yes, there was a lot of help with regards to training and so on and so forth. And I felt that probably the reason why we were not getting the kind of response we wanted, say for instance, other neighbors were getting, was probably because we were not asking the questions in the proper way. Because one of the reasons for aid is that your aid must be in alignment, your request must be in alignment with the aid that the people are willing to give. And I felt that we probably were not getting that much positive response because we were asking amiss. And so for me, it was important to go and understand where the heads of the rest of the world was with regards to this counterterrorism war. Were they approaching it from the same angle that Nigeria was approaching it from? And if they were not, was there anything we could do? And so for me, I decided to go to the George Marshall Center in Garmisch and do a course in CTOC, the PTSS course in counterterrorism, for 3 months. For me, it was very enlightening. Of course, that was truncated by COVID. But in that time, I learned a lot more than I could ever have learned. And one of the things that I learned was that globally, the counterterrorism space does not have many women. In Nigeria, we hardly have any women. And so for me, and the United Nations as well as everybody has also said that conflict resolution gets its better, it's easier when you have women at the table. And so I felt that in this world with this counterterrorism war, with its tetra-headed dimensions, and the security, of course, dimensions, the economic, the governance, the population growth, as well as just social, political, economic implications of this counterterrorism war, as well as the lack of gender in that space, that it would be something that I could fit into. And so that's what I've been doing. I came back at the beginning of the lockdowns, COVID, just at the end of, just at the beginning of the lockdowns. And so in that time, I've been reading a lot. I've been gardening a lot. I've been staying safe as the rest of the world. And I've also been engaging with the alumni from Ganish, from the George Marshall Center, and we've been interrogating the growth of counterterrorism and the effect of terrorism on coronavirus on terrorism. And it's been very interesting because we've also seen that the terrorists have used the opportunity of the destruction of the rest of the world to try to contain the virus, to get more audacious and to perpetrate more crimes. And we saw that in Chad, in Nigeria, several in Nigeria. We've seen that the bandits have gotten very audacious. So those are the conversations we've been having informally, getting ready for when the world gets back to normalcy, and then we can start to interrogate the effects and what can be done. So it's been pretty interesting work. I get the question, what's a woman like you doing in a space like that? But then I thought, as I said, that there are not enough women in that space, and I believe that it's so tetra-headed that there is a space for women in the C-Talk world, and I wanted to fit into that space. To define the Ninth Assembly, I would have that, as with all keenly contested leaderships, that there be a period of reconciliation where both the victor and the vanquished, no matter how bitter or well contested the election is, come together in the interest of the country. I found that from talking to my colleagues that there was not that seamless reintegration of the people. And I think that may have also defined a lot of things, including and then of course, the also very contentious was the emergence of the leadership of the opposition bench. Now, let me say that I believe that for any parliament to work, the opposition must be strong. For the ruling party, now the reason for the saying, and we always used to say that the majority will have its way, the minority will have it. The majority will have its way, the minority will have its say. But I also believe that, for the majority to have its way, there has to be a very robust disagreement by the minority, because the job of the minority is to interrogate the policies of the ruling party. Now, many people have questioned the democracy. Some people have even argued that democracy is not reflective because there's so many people who have dissenting views. And I think that is the reason why there's a parliament, in answer to that argument, that democracy is perfection in this space of imperfection, because there are people who will voice the desires, the concerns, the aspirations of the people who are not in the majority. Now, from what I have gleaned from my almost laid-back vision of the National Assembly, I have seen, and this unfortunately is an indictment both of the members of the opposition and as well of the leadership of the country, because I think that the people in the opposition seem to be very silent. And the opposition and the ruling party seems, or the leadership or the majority seems to enjoy the silence of the people in the opposition. For me, it doesn't make for a very robust conversation. I think that quite a few good things have been done. I see that there are interventions in things that are of interest to the people. For instance, there are interventions in the strikes, the doctor strikes, at times when we needed them the most as frontliners. And so for that, you must applaud them. We've seen that there's been interventions, teachers and so on and so forth. For that, you must applaud them. But I have also been very concerned in the recent past of interventions in institutions. I understand, and I speak particularly to the issue of interference into the Nigerian army. I think that for us to have a strong democracy, we must have a strong military. I believe that the military on its own, we have an overstretched, ill-equipped probably, but overstretched military. And Nigeria is at war. In the northeast, in the northwest, in the north central, it's war. I mean, we're losing soldiers on a daily basis. And I think that the one thing that the world is watching is a military that is competent to deal with external threats. Now, I also believe that as much as we want to protect the citizens, we must protect our military. Because unless we have a strong military, we have a failed democracy. And I believe that the National Assembly should, in everything that we do, respect the borders and the boundaries of the military, and allow the military to direct its affairs based on military rules, based on military protocols, based on military traditions. As civilians, we can comment, but only to the extent that we don't interfere, weaken the military, reduce the morale of the soldiers, and give international impression that our military is indisciplined and our soldiers are mutinous. For me, those are areas of grave concern. I think that the National Assembly has intervened in things, timely, on time, but I think that we must also confine ourselves to the things that we do in the interest of motherland, because it is imperative that when your country is at war, it is the civilian leaders that when your country, when your military is weak, it is the civilian leaders that suffer the most. So I think that the National Assembly should step back a bit on the interference in the military, and as much as possible support our military, because they're the only people who have a job where you pay with your life. We don't. You go to the National Assembly, the expectation is that you're not going to die. A soldier's expectation is that he's going to die, and I think that we need to give them a bit more respect and allow them run the military based, as I said, on tradition, protocols, and of the military. That would be my one downside. But otherwise, I'd say, it's work in progress. It's just 1 year. We'll continue to watch that space, and hopefully we'll see a bit more interest from the opposition and a bit more tolerance from the majority. Synergy is a good thing. But to borrow your terms, a super romance is, because by the very nature of the National Assembly, our job is the oversight, we're the checks, and we're the checks on the executive. So when you call it a super romance, the assumption based on that term is that there are no checks. Now for me, I think that if there are no checks, it may defeat, and I use the word may advisedly, it may defeat the very purpose for which there is a legislature. Because the job of the legislator is to collate the aggregate opinion of a critical mass of the people at whose pleasure you serve.
Yeah.
And I know that there are dissenting voices. I know that especially in these periods and in these COVID periods where the entire world has taken an economic hit, where people started to interrogate less accommodatingly the role of their governments, where people expected government to be more visible, where people were despondent, people were hungry, people were angry, and people were scared. And with that lethal combination makes people interrogate more and demand more of their government. Now, hitherto, the Nigerian people took for granted the fact that government will do certain things. But with the lockdown, we found that a lot more people were on the internet. We found that a lot more people were seeing things that were happening in different climes. And a lot more people were learning from different climes. And a lot more people started to realize that it was their duty to interrogate the functions of government. Now, based on that, they probably started to think that the National Assembly's duty was to, on their behalf, interrogate the functions of government, to interrogate the steps the government was taking because the people were scared, there was no clarity as to the coronavirus, as to what it was they were to do with it or about it or how to stay safe. There was confusion about the lockdown. Nigeria, a large percentage of Nigeria's economy is in the informal sector, and so these were people who, as they said, we have a hunt and kill economy where people had to go out on a daily basis, hunt and come back. If you didn't go out, you didn't eat. And so there was also anger. Now, some people say it was underlying anger from certain infrastructural deficits, in the eyes of certain people, governance deficits, etc., etc. And they expected the National Assembly to take a more decisive role in the interest of the people. A lot of people didn't see that. And so because they didn't see that, and they had gotten to the place where they started to interrogate their government with a bit more scrutiny, a lot of people were more angry. And so a lot of names started to fly around. I think that at this time, and I know that when the National Assembly even shut down, there are a lot of people called for the National Assembly to come back on. Because as far as they were concerned, that was the governance space that they would see, and that was the governance space, as far as they were concerned, that was the most empty. And so in spite of the fact that there was a lot of fear and it was peaking, there was a clamor for the National Assembly to come back. Now, of course, there's been also a lot of concern about the number of loans. And, and the reason that has happened is because, as I said, people are now more interested in what their governments are doing. And so things that people would probably have discountenanced in the past, people are starting to set up and take knowledge of and interest and take a notice of. And so you find that a lot of people are concerned that the National Assembly is probably not interrogating the loans as much as they should. And when you have members of the National Assembly saying that the government is taking loans that are written in Chinese, it is very worrying for the average Nigerian who has learned to watch the governance space. And so when those things emanate from within the National Assembly, you can't but expect that the Nigerians who are watching that space start to be concerned about this, what your term, and which I love, is about this super romance. And so that naturally, I would say, is something to be concerned about. So, but is it good for arms of government to work in synergy? Absolutely. But working in synergy in a way that still does not take away from the core functions of what it is those arms were created to be. The executive arm of government will execute the projects. The National Assembly's job is the job of oversight over laws, appropriations, and policies, as well as making the laws that govern the executive and the judiciary. So and the judiciary, of course, to act as mediator between all the arms of government and everything else. So I think that there must be this synergy of working together, but each one in its own silo doing what it must do to check, to create the balance that makes the people feel that they are part of government. So I think that, yes, it's a good thing to work with the executive, but I also think that the other eye must be on the people at whose pleasure we serve. I was aghast at that outburst. I was quite aghast because, we in the 6th and 7th and 8th assemblies, we took the word hallowed chambers very seriously. And the reason why it was called the hallowed chambers, is with all hallowed places, was that people were expected to act with the highest amount of decorum within that space. Now, to have seen a degeneration to the point where there was a screaming bout between both was, for me, novel, and I was honestly quite aghast. But I believe that the job of the National Assembly is to oversight laws, appropriations, and policies. I do not know by what parameters. I understand that the federal government used the people who were like the NURTW, civil society organizations, women leaders, and so on and so forth, as a parameter for the distribution of, or for the selection process of the beneficiaries of that. But I also believe that as representatives of the people, that, there could have been a working together. And which brings me to your other question, that if there is this super romance between the executive and the National Assembly, it's very curious that at a point where there should have been that super romance, there was, everybody decided to work in their silos. Now, the National Assembly has the right to interrogate the selection process. And if they found that it was not inclusive enough, then it is within their oversight functions to interrogate that process. Now, I do not know what the outcome of the interrogation of that process was, and I believe that that may have been the point at which there was a degeneration of the conversation. But I think that the Honorable Minister could have made his point without losing his temper, shouting. And the honorable members who were the ones who sought interrogation could also have been a bit more, a bit calmer in the face of that unwarranted provocation. So I'd say that, that the job of oversight and seeking clarifications can sometimes be quite a heated occasion, but I was truly aghast, and I think that if there was indeed transparency in that selection process, then it shouldn't have been a problem to intimate the parliamentarians as to how they came about the numbers, the names, and come up with some kind of verification as to that. I think that tempers were flared, and I thought it was absolutely unnecessary. I think rape has become a pandemic in Nigeria, the numbers had always been that 1 in 3 women will be sexually harassed or from at its mildest verbal sexual harassment, and at its ugliest rape, sometimes death. And we also saw a rise in femicides. A lot of women were getting killed, a lot of and I think that there must be disincentive for rape. We saw a rise in pedophilia, and I've often asked myself, do we see this rise in pedophilia because of the democratization of information, or is it a new trend? Or has it always been there? And people just never talked about it, probably because of also cultural considerations, or is it a new trend? But whatever it is, it has reached pandemic proportions. And I think that there is no crime, there is no punishment that is too small for a man who rapes a 3-year-old girl. There is no punishment too big for a man who takes a woman against her will. Now, let me make the point that everybody talks about rape as if it is a crime that is confined to women. There are so many young boys who are raped as well. And so I hope that the argument for it or against it is not because of one of these gender-based discriminations as usual, because most people don't want to wrap their minds around the fact that boys also get raped. Now, the stigmatization for sodomy is probably worse in the eyes of the people who have the political space, which of course, unfortunately, as usual, we know that in the political space we only have 3% of Nigerian women represented in leadership and in governance. And so when you have a 97% of men in the leadership space, and they just don't want to deal with the fact that sodomy is as rife as rape. So, they've decided that rape is a female thing. And with the discrimination that goes with all things female, and not enough female voices in governance, at the highest places in government, they've decided that rape is a woman thing. But rape is not a woman thing. It's an across sexes thing. Now, I believe that when a woman says no, a lot of people look at rape as she had sex against her will. But the worst kind of vilification, the worst kind of invasion of privacy, the worst kind of trespassing into your space is taking your body against your will. Now, a lot of women don't have much. Poverty wears a woman's face in Nigeria and in Africa, but especially in Nigeria. The only thing that a woman has that is truly hers is her body. And so when a person rapes her, takes away her right, it's one of the most painful things, especially when you know that you have a society that punishes the raped, that punishes the victim. When you know that by going to the police, you probably will be mocked and laughed at. When you know that going to court, the burden is on you to prove that you were raped. It is one of the most painful, invasive, dehumanizing things you can do to anybody. Now, when you now take it a step further and you have a man, a 30-year-old man, a 40-year-old man, rape a 3-year-old girl, that person is sick. And then even the person, a pedophile everywhere in the world, there are pedophile lists. They're ostracized from society in the states, in developed worlds. They say that within the prisons, that when a pedophile is sentenced, and there's statistics to prove it, that they get attacked by fellow prisoners. And so these are people the society has put away because they're menace to society. Even rejecting those people, that just brings to the very fore the depth of depravity of people who do those things. And I think that to give them a pat on the back or to lock them up with people who have done other things is not the way. I honestly believe that there is no crime, there is no punishment too much for those people. And a few men have spoken out about it. As a matter of fact, the other day I was listening to Honorable Ukeje, and in his very expressive way, Honorable Ukeje was very, very expressive in saying that as far as he was concerned, that castration wasn't such a bad crime. Now, some people may say it's barbaric, but then the act of rape in itself is barbaric. The act of pedophilia is doubly barbaric. And so, you may say, do you believe in an eye for an eye or the death penalty for death? That's different. The arguments are out there. The political arguments about whether or not that should be. But I think that we must come up with a punishment that adequately mirrors the enormity of that crime. And I just think that, an amendment to a longer prison sentence just doesn't quite cut it, because we have seen an exponential escalation of the numbers in the public space. And I think we must do something as a disincentive to that crime. And I think that right now that the political space is very fluid. I think that, and Nigerians are very aware, I think that what the Nigerian people require is good governance. What the Nigerian people want is a track record, a proven track record of governance. I think that what the Nigerian people require is a government that is going to be responsible and responsive to their needs. A government that is going to have vision, a government that has vision. What the people require is a government that pulls us out of the infrastructural decay, that pulls us out of governance deficits, that pulls us out of the economic depression that the world finds itself. Now, and I continue to refer to COVID because that's who we are now. We're in a world that battles COVID, and we must prepare for a world post-COVID. Now, post-COVID, you've seen that the largest, the greatest, the strongest economies in the world are crashing. And so we're going to need leadership that is innovative, that is able to help us sustain this onslaught, this economic onslaught that has been brought on the rest of the world. And so the expectations of the Nigerians are going to go, I believe, beyond parties. Now, everybody has argued, and on the internet you see that there's a lot of movements between PDP and the APC and the APC and the PDP. And so a lot of people are even a little worried about the two political parties. But I believe that the Nigerian people would be seeking leadership, purposeful, driven leadership that opens up the spaces, that gives hope to the next generation, that creates opportunity for all shades of its society, that puts Nigeria back on the map, that deals with the issues of terrorism, that protects our borders, that builds our military, that creates opportunities, that opens up the market, that creates diversification, a government that is single-minded to create jobs, that puts high on its list education, that is able to educate its people, that brings us back to the confidence that we had. And I think that if the PDP finds a person that can inspire that confidence in the Nigerian people, then the PDP will be ready to win. Now, the Southeast has a right to aspire to leadership. Every zone has a right. The Southeast, everybody has a right to aspire to the leadership of a country that you claim citizenship of. Now, if it were based on the federal character, then we would say that it's unfair. Unfortunately, politics is not about federal. It's not based on the principles of federal character. But I believe that the Southeast has more than a legitimate right to aspire to the leadership of this country because we claim citizenship to this country. But in a country with a multiplicity of interests, I also believe that the Southeast, in being very right to claim rights, in being very, in having legitimate rights to that, I believe that we should also reach out to the other zones. Otherwise, and we must also start to have the conversation in a way that ensures that we get the interest of the rest of the country. Unfortunately, nobody is going to make way for the Southeast, unfortunately. That's what we've seen in politics. But I believe, as I say, that some people have made the arguments that we shouldn't go to the Southeast. But I believe without any equivocation that the Southeast has more than ample right to aspire to that leadership. For the people who clamor that it goes back to the North, politics is about clamor. You know, there will be interests, especially a country as diverse as ours. There's going to be multi-layered, multifaceted interests interfacing with one another for the leadership of the country. But I believe, and I've always said it, that the East has more than its own. I mean, the East is beautifully positioned to aspire to that leadership, and we just have to work at it and ensure that the rest of the country recognizes the fact that we have the people who, I think, in all the things that I've listed, who have the credentials so to do, and I hope that, you know, the rest of the country listens. I think so.